I have to say that it's been a very long time indeed since I've paid attention to anything the so-called Sargon of Akkad has said. And the only reason I came across this was because he appeared on Chad Williamson's podcast. Now, I semi-regularly listen to Chad Williamson's podcasts just because of the huge dearth of interesting podcasts and something to listen to in my daily walk. But Sargon of Akkad was on there, and he made some very interesting statements. Well, not really interesting, quite the opposite, in fact. And they're very telling and very indicative of something that Sargon of Akkad has always suffered from. That is short-sightedness, hubris, arrogance, and thinking way too highly of himself, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on in the contemporary world. So let's have a listen to what Sargon's moral imperative is. We're calling it that. Sargon's moral imperative, his reproductive moral imperative, that de facto having children, reproducing, is always a moral obligation for reasons he cites. Then we can talk about why that may or may not be the case afterwards.
And you're essentially absconding your position in the great chain of civilization. If you, like, every individual is the result of a lineage that goes back like 1 billion years, to the very, very first organisms, to you, and you're like, yeah, so I don't need to carry on that chain. I can just abolish all of that. I'm just going to live off other people's effort and energy. It's like, you selfish. What makes you think you have the right to just be like, yeah, I don't need to do anything about upholding this civilization by producing future generations for it. I'm the sort of person who's going to get myself sterilized. I'm going to sit there and drink my wine and live off the fruits of this, like some sort of conqueror. It's like, no. And this is a totally unsustainable attitude. It's not going to last. You're going to be miserable, and you're a really selfish piece of shit.
I don't know if it's a moral obligation, but I definitely think that it's an optimal way for society to move forward.
Okay, let me stop you there, right? I don't give about what's optimal. It is a moral obligation because all their life they relied on the that other people had done. And if they think that they can just inherit all of this and say, I'm just going to take, then that makes them selfish, which is a moral judgment. It is a moral obligation.
Interesting.
I've been thinking about this a lot.
I can tell. Yeah, I can tell. Is this what keeps you awake at night?
There's nothing wrong with us. There's nothing wrong with it. Does. There's nothing wrong with us asserting these sort of deep concepts that we have naturally in our language.
So the first thing to note, of course, is just how self-satisfied Sargon is with himself. He's asked the question. I've been thinking about this a lot. Oh, I have. Aren't I smart? I'm so smart. And then towards the end, of course, he says that this is something deep and profound. There's nothing wrong with talking about deep and profound concepts. I mean, what's deeper than talking about having sex and popping kids out? There's nothing deeper and more profound than that in life, right? Now, I don't really want to turn this into some sort of natalist versus anti-natalist discussion, because that will just go on endlessly, and that's just a matter of ideological commitment or lack thereof. So I'm going to avoid talking about some of this stuff. Now, what I do want to get into is the distinction between moral prescriptions and moral proscriptions. Prescriptions are a lot more difficult to execute and carry out than proscriptions. So, for example, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not, etc., etc. For example, it's a lot easier for most individuals to not smash the window in of the store, or to not run over people, or clock somebody over the head with a baseball bat. You shouldn't do these things, therefore don't do them. Prescriptions require proactivity. You need to be proactive about various things. And generally speaking, it's a matter of degree. So one prescription that seems to be relatively easy to carry out is the converse of thou shalt not steal, thou shalt buy. Nobody says thou shalt buy, but it's implied. When you go to the supermarket and you choose not to hold up the checkout clerk, and you choose not to steal things there, and you choose to purchase items with money, you are engaging in prescriptive behavior, de facto. But again, it is a matter of degree. Now, I don't, as I said, want to get too much into the weeds about natalism or anti-natalism. I certainly have my own views on these things. But let's really talk about the elephant in the room, and that is the nature of Sargon of Akkad himself. He's incredibly arrogant, as I pointed out, filled with hubris, and incredibly satisfied with his own assertions and observations, and always leaving out certain convenient facts. The fact that all of us who are still on YouTube are the product of luck. We were there at the right time in the right place, myself included. I've never once said anything profound or amazing, but I was around at the right time and the right place. And Sargon, for the record, was too. And so, in his case, it was able to catapult him to fame and wealth, etc., etc. So now he's in the very convenient position, due to sheer luck, that he can say, it is a moral obligation for you to have children because yada, 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 yada. The problem with this prescription is he makes it seem as if it's as simple as buying the apples at the store versus stealing them. Just go out and have kids. It's really simple. But is it really? There are all sorts of reasons why people don't choose to have children. And there's the other question. Should everyone just have children? Because Lord Sargon himself lives in the UK, and I am pretty sure that there are some council houses not too far away from him, or probably not since he's wealthy and lives in a nice neighborhood now, but some council houses somewhere away from him that are filled with so-called chavs who've had tons of children. They're very moral, upright people, aren't they? Because they are having lots of children, and that is a moral obligation that every individual has. But again, he's overlooking certain basic realities. He says, to the hells with the idea of what is optimal and what's not. But the problem is, if you want to have moral prescriptions, they need to be enforceable. Some are, for example, you should buy the apples as opposed to stealing them. Others a lot less so. In order to have children, an individual requires another person of the opposite sex. You need to find a relationship that's functional and working. In an ideal world, you'd also get married without the risks that are involved in marriage. And so it goes, and so it goes. And that is a much more difficult prescription to fulfill. And not everyone can do it. Just as not everyone can, in fact, just buy the apples as opposed to steal them, although the vast majority of people can, not everyone is going to be able to find the requisite person in order to engage in this very moral act of copulation and therefore chucking kids into the world. That is something that he completely overlooks. I'm not one to really speak of privilege, but again, the guy got lucky. There's nothing remarkable about Sargon. He thinks his insights are wondrous and amazing, and yet he's just another YouTuber, like me, like anyone else, who got lucky and has been around for a long time. I'm not anybody special. At least I'm aware of that. But for some reason, a lot of YouTubers, and you could argue that Sargon is in many ways the embodiment of this, really let it get to their heads. They really let it get to their heads. They just have something special to say, and every word they utter and every breath is just amazing. He's been thinking about it a lot. Ha ha ha. A lot. And yes, it's profound. Having sex and reproducing is profound, a profound act. And so I'm going to disagree with him quite profoundly. There is no relevance to the idea of what is optimal or what is enforceable or what is feasible. And they say what you want about Chad Williamson, but at least he acknowledges that, even if it's based partly on hesitation. If something is a moral prescription, but it is not actionable in a very simple and easy way, it's a bad moral prescription, typically. And in today's climate, it is very difficult to find the quote-unquote right person to reproduce with. Now, sure, as I've mentioned, there are tons of chavs and council houses in the UK having kids left and right. But I think all of us know that that's not what Lord Sargon is talking about. He's not talking about random people having kids. I mean, maybe he is. It's hard to say. It's not clear based on his statements. But the circumstances that most people exist in the current year, in the current meta, in 2022, are not such that they lend themselves to simply finding a person, settling down, and having kids. And I want to bring up another factor that isn't necessarily indicative of a blow below the belt, but as always, Sargon loves posturing, and he's posturing here up to the wazoo, and he's posturing as a conservative. Who knows what he really thinks, ultimately? It's impossible to say. Classical liberalism has been his spiel for eons now. But one of the most conservative talking points, of course, is don't marry single mothers, which is what he originally did. He originally married a single mother when he had fewer resources, less fame, less status, eventually reproduced with her, right? So he has effectively one child, and he's a stepfather. Now, I'm not in the moral business. I don't care. I'm not a conservative. I don't even necessarily condemn that because I don't care, as I am not a conservative and I am not interested in the moral qualities of such things. But if he is a conservative, surely he shouldn't be endorsing something like that. And so we see that even Sargon at some point in time was down and out on his luck, and he found what he could because it was the best available thing. Well, imagine the circumstances today. Imagine if you're not wealthy and YouTube famous. What are the options available to you? How easily is his moral prescription put into action? And I will argue it's not easy at all. And therefore, it's a junk moral prescription. It's one thing to say, don't steal. It's one thing to say, don't kill. You need to go out and do all this stuff. And indeed, many people try. People try to find partners. Men, in particular, try to find partners. But these days, the majority, maybe even the vast majority of men, are probably not going to find any. And they're certainly not going to find wives to settle down with. And so all this ends up being is this airy, effete proclamation to the wind based on his own arrogance and hubris. And it gets us nowhere. Yes, it's important to talk about things that are feasible and optimal, because ideally you want to be able to enforce them. They need to be actionable. Anyone can scream at the sky and claim, oh, this is moral, everyone should do this. And if it's too far-fetched, nothing will come of it. And it simply is astonishing that he doesn't take that into account. But again, Sargon has always been a bit too big for his britches. He thinks he's much smarter than he actually is. He doesn't acknowledge that most YouTubers, myself included, we're just average guys. We're nothing special. He's also nothing special. He's just an average guy. For some reason, though, he's utterly convinced of his own statements, which is baffling to me, but it might be something to do with YouTube fame. I guess some people suffer from that. Now, of course, there are all sorts of other arguments I could make. I wanted to simply focus on the proclamation that it is immoral to not have children. Yeah, that is simply due to the lack of pragmatism behind it, due to the difficulty involved. And for many people, many individuals, in particular men, the unachievability of it, a ridiculous prescription to make, which, again, totally flies past Sargon because he's Sargon, right? Sargon thinks everyone is really wealthy and has lots of money at their disposal and can just go about these things with no problem. And on top of that, can just find the right partner. It's almost as if he thinks that. It's almost as if he's not observing the reality he inhabits and the things around him. Now, maybe he is, and he's just reluctant to say that, but based on the evidence I've looked at, no, he does not, and he's not aware of these things. And by the way, most guys who end up marrying single mothers are not wealthy or YouTube famous, and so it doesn't turn out particularly well for them. Anyway, I suspect that in the years to come, Sargon will continue to put his foot in his mouth and believe as he ages that he's ever wiser, ever smarter, ever more knowledgeable than all other people, and he will continue to make such bizarre and audacious statements, all the while ignoring the facts on the ground, because he is Sargon, or Sargon of Akkad. As always, thank you for tuning in. Please hit the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment, share. As always, may the gods watch over you. And if I'm still alive, I will check you out later. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.